I want to thank you for taking some time to chat with us today. It's a real thrill for us.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very honored to be able to do that. I understand you're a musician yourself as well, and a composer, right?
I am indeed.
Very good.
All right. That's a good start, right? So we have an exciting new release from you. MAP, of course, which is a collaboration with drummer Greg Albin and some very interesting diverse guests, including John Avila from Oingo Boingo. How did you go about choosing these musicians for this project?
I had recorded actually three numbers, three titles for my Time Code album exactly 30 years ago. That was recorded at the record plant in Los Angeles, but I had discovered those guys actually in a club while I was still, of course, a member of the Moody Blues at the time. We had a few days off in LA, and I had known Greg Albin a few years even before, but then one night I was invited to that club in Manhattan Beach, and there was a group called Ice playing, and he was on drums, and John Avila was on bass. He was just kind of a top 40, the really hard rock top 40 type of band, and I was very impressed by the rhythm section. And I asked them if they would join me in the studio to record 3-piece for my Time Code album. And, they did really an excellent job. I was really, really very impressed with their playing and their behavior in the studio. I think that was their first gig in a very big and known studio at the time. And we had an excellent engineer, Lee DiCarlo, for those specific 3 numbers. And then we always stayed in contact over the years, and I've been living in Los Angeles for many, many years also, but I was always extremely busy. Greg, I understand, was always busy and so on. And one day, some time ago, he called me and asked me if I wanted to compose some music for him to play with me, and maybe with John and maybe some other musicians. So, I composed about 14 pieces for to choose from, and we acquainted again. I mean, I traveled to Los Angeles many times, and we went to the studio. I had composed already the bulk, of course, of the material, and then it was like flowing. It was like a decision to take the musicians we had, like Lenny Castro and Dave Van Sach, and I had a very good friend also in Switzerland, fantastic bass player Patrick Moraz, whom I've already recorded, the material for 2 CDs there in Switzerland, because I've got another group there,
Oh.
And, that's how it came. I mean, John Avila was also found some time, to record with us. I mean, when people have to gather, even through the United States, and be on time at the same time in the studio, it's not always that easy. Although we've done, of course, some of the recordings via the internet, like I do quite regularly with other producers.
It's a wonderful thing, the internet. The old days, if you wanted to collaborate with someone, the only way to do it was to get on a plane and go to wherever. Now, you can collaborate with somebody in Europe or Asia, simply by exchanging files. It's really quite amazing.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it is.
Hopefully we'll be able to record that quite in a not too distant future. But I've got also some other projects in the pipeline, and some with some very, very interesting transcultural percussion from all over the world, from Africa and so on, and I've been to so many. I was privileged to be able to go to so many countries And I've been like 53 times to Africa, and I've had a lot of contacts with some fantastic percussionists from different countries,
So how does a keyboard player such as yourself have such a fascination with percussion?
Well, I mean,
right?
The rhythm's the basis of communication anyway. From century, I mean, millenniums. I mean, from the start of the universe. I mean, rhythm is there's no machinery, there's no art without some kind of a rhythm. And since it's the basis of communication, communication is the basis of life, really.
Absolutely.
And, it's a very, very kind of basic feeling, more even than an understanding, And I think the musicians who are able to have that kind of intrinsic rhythm in their organisms are really probably have the chance to become really great musicians and communicate with everybody.
Oh. And the album is a beautiful album, by the way. I just want to compliment you on it. And it seems, what I love about it is that it seems to successfully blend like all the different styles of these very individual musicians that are on it, especially in the bass, and there's some very distinctive sounds, like for example from John Avila, that really pulse through, and it's very, very interesting in the overall mix of things. But for me, the cut that really stands out is the last cut on the album, which is Alien Species. And the song, it moves like a beautiful meditation. It's so deeply textured and tranquil. Can you talk a little bit about how that piece was composed?
Well, that's the beauty of having, that's the beauty of having at my disposal some instruments and some keyboards and some sounds that I've been developing over the years. I mean, there's nothing really. It's really not complex at all, and that's why I wanted to make it flowing like that. And I think Greg Orban did a very good job with this cymbal. He only plays cymbals.
Yes.
In this piece. And also, I was very fortunate to have been able to keep a fantastic instrument, which is the VL1 from Yamaha. It's a synthesizer of very special. It's kind of monophonic synthesizer, which I've developed some samples for, and I was able to do this very long clouds of chords, very simple kind of chords. But what I like is that, for example, there's this transition, I think, after maybe 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes, and I was really immersed in my mind, immersed in some kind of a parallel universe when I did that. And I was completely straight. I've got to tell you that also. But I was like in a parallel universe in my mind. I mean, I think I've composed that with my eyes closed.
Yes. It's a beautiful piece. It really is. And, it's funny too. I noticed at least 3 of the cuts on the album make reference to aliens. Was this was this intentional, or is this just something that you have some sort of a fascination with?
Well, I have a fascination, of course, for everything extraterrestrial, potentially, and I'm always fascinated by the universe. One of my very, very good, since I was a kid, one of my very best friends, actually, my buddy from the same desk in school in Switzerland, became actually the first European person to become an astronaut for NASA, and to go on Endeavour to repair the Hubble Space Telescope 4 times in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
You know? And when we were kids, also my cousin, one of my cousins, Michel Mayor, was also is the astrophysicist who is the first ever astrophysicist to have discovered the first extrasolar planet, Pegasi 51b. And when we were kids, I remember we used to go, not even in our teens, but before that, we used to go around the mountains, around Switzerland, around the lake of Le Mans and so on, and in even some area of mountains called the Pleiades, and his father was a very, very pointed kind of scientist, and he had some Geiger counters with machines, all machines to measure, levels of potentially uranium and, in the mountains. And we used to go and do some explorations, and then sometimes we used to camp at night and look at the stars, and that's how it developed. So I mean, for me, also, I mean, the word alien is no stranger to my vocabulary, because I'm personally, funny enough, I'm personally a registered alien. It's actually written on my green card. I mean, which is not green, of course, but it's funny that I use the word alien, and I love everything to do with that kind of word, and I've even been able to develop or to reserve a couple of names on the internet through one of those networks where you get some names, and the .com and .net and so on. And I've got one which is called alienintelligence.net.
I'll have to visit that.
I don't know even what I'm going to do with it, but I thought it was funny to be able to do that, and...
you know what? I'm right there with you, so I share that enthusiasm. Patrick, what kinds of things inspire you to create?
Anything. You see, I think spontaneity is probably the most important, one of the most important factors in the inspiration of an artist, and that has to be really the first burst of creativity comes through spontaneity of action. And that's what I always talk about. Sometimes I've been able to also been asked to do some lectures about creativity and technology specifically. And I've always kind of said as a preface to my lectures, even when I talk to the audience and so on, that the epitome of creativity lies in the state of dynamic tension between extreme forces in opposition, meaning that if there is spontaneity of action and pure inspiration of the soul, which of course differentiates us from animals and machines. I'm not saying that animals don't have a soul, but what differentiates us from those organisms is the fact that we can have bursts of creativity on a very, very spontaneous level, an emotional level, which really differentiates mankind from human and machines, even in the future. And that's probably the last bastion of humanity for mankind is the emotional feeling that we get, throughout different experiences. Through our mind and through our souls, and that is the most important thing. Now, on the other side, of course, the more extreme force of that opposition would be what I would call the prose of fabrication, which is as important, probably, if not sometimes more important. I know that some artists and some groups develop such a sense of being able to build complex architectures in their art that, for example, Yes, as a group, is a prime example of that. It's a fantastic way to work as a group, because there is of course the possibility of jamming and inventing on the spot with a group at a level of what I would call the highest order of information transfer. That's jamming in real time for musicians is faster than the speed of light, and that is a fantastic thing. But a group as well constructed as, for example, I'm taking Yes because I was a part of the group in the 70s. The possibility of keeping those first bursts of creativity and ideas and put them and around a very solid and intelligent and brilliant architecture is really it's really fantastic.
That is special, because so many times, and I know this, from my own experiences with creating music, being inspired. A lot of times that burst comes and it goes, and without the mechanism to really capture it and, as you said, put it into action, put it into form, is where so much great work is lost. And one of my questions actually for you was, I'd like to talk a little bit about your creative process. So when you are inspired, once you have the inspiration, how does that process unfold for you? Like, do you go right to the piano, or do you go for a long walk? Do you, what happens? How do you take that and make it into something real?
I make sure that as the same time as I have this kind of inspiration, I'm able to remember it exactly the way it came, and that is really not always as easy as that. And it's exactly, to answer exactly your question. I love your questions, by the way. Very, very, very acute and intelligent questions. And of course, you're a musician, and to have the possibility of recording, of being able to record oneself on the spot, with whether it's with an iPhone or a machine or a keyboard or a workstation or whatever, or even, if I'm at the piano, I will play that piece over and over, or record it immediately. And that's what I was able to do several times. I'm still doing that, actually, as much as I can in the studio or whatever. But in the 70s already, I did a series of albums which I called Future Memories, where I was actually playing directly in the morning, for example, on a grand piano. I recorded 2 pieces directly on the grand piano. In the afternoon, I switched to an array of 7 keyboards. It's very specifically chosen and so on, but I didn't have any idea what I was going to play. And I did that in front of TV cameras in Switzerland, in a very good studio. And the next day, I was able to record a piece in 3 movements of 18 minutes on a rig of 29 keyboards and machines, And I pursued the experience in the early 80s, and I did the Future Memories too, exactly the same way, but in different movements. And I did, instead of spending 2 days in the studio, I spent 3 days in the studio. But every note of these 2 works these two albums actually came on the spot, directly at the moment they happened, and there was no edits and not even any remixing in some instances, and certainly not edits to make the pieces more more architectured or whatever. It's exactly as the music came.
That's extraordinary.
And I mean that's there's a lot of people who unfortunately like the music I've done and so on, but they're not even aware of that, and it's kind of of course for a musician like yourself, you understand exactly what I'm talking about, but for the people who are just and thanks to them, just listeners and fans, some people don't have a clue of what creativity is all about, and spontaneous creativity, improvisation, and so on, whether it's in a classical mode or in jazz, of course, jazz mode. I mean, I've been very influenced by the jazz of many decades, and by historical figures that I was privileged and to meet and talk with, and even have some lessons, encounters with.
Yeah, well said. Now, as an early pioneer, using electronic keyboards, you've seen many changes, no doubt, in the application of these instruments in all forms of music. Are you partial to pure form analog synths, or have you embraced the digital synths as well?
Yes, to a certain extent, of course. I mean, it's always once again, it's the same kind of thing. The marriage between analog technologies and digital technologies actually creates really it helps us to go even further, in the choice of sound and the building of clusters or whatever, and that's really a fantastic thing. Fortunately enough, I've never been attached to too much schooling and too much respect of a very particular style. I know some musicians who are, I'm not going to name them here, and some of them are very, very good friends of mine, but they never allow themselves to go from one specific style to another one, to jump from one style to another style in the same piece of music, and that's I never could understand why they couldn't do that. And the fact that I've been able to also travel around the world and listen to a lot of transcultural musical operations, to say the least, really helped me to be able to do that jump very easily between styles. And I personally don't have so much of a problem, about that. But that's me,
Well, no, but it's a good point, because it's kind of like, if you had to make an analogy, it would kind of be like going to a museum to only look at one type of art and never wanting to look at anything else, So
right.
Yeah. Now, your work with Yes and the Moody Blues has been very influential in establishing electronics in general in music. Most notably, you had a release back in 2011. It was a Live from Abbey Road, right? And that's like where you have a very, it's almost a daring use of electronic music, because it attempts to emulate the classical styles. And I was wondering, at that time, did you find yourself relating to some of the early pioneers who tried that, like Wendy Carlos with her switched on Bach?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, and Isautomita and Wendy Carlos, and of course, I mean, Wendy Carlos, even when he was Walter Carlos, and she's the prime example of this kind of attained perfection, or almost perfection about doing exactly that, and that composer, that person, Wendy Carlos and Isao Tomita were absolutely at the forefront of my influences as well in electronic music, as well as the makers of these instruments, like Bukla and of course Bob Moog, who was a very, very good friend of mine, and all these kind of electronics, even of course the composers of the 20th century music, like Stockhausen and whom I knew personally, and Xenakis as well, and even Boulez, and to be able to really absorb all these influences and translate that into a different array of creative bursts of work. It's really a fantastic opportunity, fantastic experience.
It is.
I'm very, very grateful to be able to have been in that kind of time frame, to be able to do that.
Nice. So the music industry has changed so much since the 70s and, those giant arena days, and, musicians now, I believe, from what I learned from speaking with a lot of, career musicians like yourself, now primarily draw their incomes from touring, not so much the sale of the music. How have these changes influenced you as a career musician?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because, of course, there are always, the stars of the moment, and some of them remain at the forefront of their career and so on, and big names and so on, and singers especially, and rappers, of course, now. You take a Dr. Dre, who can release in one day 56 million downloads of a song or a rap song or whatever. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's fantastic. Now, of course, the operation, like you said, the operation to tour is a very, very, very sophisticated and very pointed kind of business, and it has to have a large infrastructure of organization to be able to do that for certain artists, And like the other day, I even went to see Toto and Yes in a hall which was not more than 3,500 people, which is really small for two groups of that status, But it was fantastic, and the way it was organized. Would you believe that I was invited to the show? I was not even able to go and see the guys from Toto, whom I knew personally, because to come out from the seat and to go backstage, they were already gone to the next town for their next show, And I wanted to say hello to Lenny Castro, who is actually part of the. Yeah, and he plays on 6 of those cuts, and they're already gone. That was unbelievable. But the only thing I eventually noticed as well is that when there's of course so many people, so many fans who have bought tickets and so on, I know that in a small hall like that, the sound system was not as it is generally in the first 20 rows, and that was really interesting to see that on the right of the stage there was the monitoring mixer, and the people mixing, monitoring, and on the left of the stage was the mixer of the hall sound, the sound in the hall. And I was wondering how they could actually determine exactly how good, and how precise the sound was, being on the side of the stage instead of in front of the band, 20 rows further back.
And it's interesting, right? It's like doing the sound of a hall in layers.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you've played, of course, to audiences in excess of 125,000 people, as we know from the days with Yes and Moody Blues, and are you ever prepared for that type of a reception? I mean, to step out onto a stage in front of 125,000 people.
Well, it's actually, it's a very gradual kind of operation. Once you start, and you certainly know that yourself, once you start doing concerts, you start in clubs, and then you play in small theaters and so on. And at the time, it was just a very gradual kind of thing. But having also participated as an audience member in some of the big festivals, actually that's what makes me decide to become a musician. Is it's not that I'm not an agoraphobic a person, but I could have sensed that I would be much more comfortable on a stage in front of 100,000 people in the future than amongst them as a listener in the audience. Even if I were in the first row or the 20th row or the 100th row in a stadium, and that really helped me make my decision. That's what I want to do. I want to be a musician on the stage.
Yes. When I was thinking about doing this interview, it's only natural because, Yes was such a gigantic part of not just my own personal, musical exploration in history, but, of the 70s. I mean, it was huge. So it was natural to think that, we were going to delve into some questions about Yes, but I didn't want to go there too much because, I wanted this to focus a little more on you, your creative process, what you're doing now. But I had to borrow some of it, and I was reading. I was on your site, and I saw a very moving tribute to Chris Squire that you wrote there. And you referenced a little bit of what you were speaking of before, where you had this incredible synergy with them when you would play, and I was very moved by that. I thought it was very poignant and touching.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and it's exactly what I was feeling when I received the news, and that's what came to my mind instantly. What I wrote, even if it appeared a couple of days after it passed, but I wrote that very in one burst of my hand to the paper. I had a pen. I wrote it down, and just like that, and I had this empathy with Chris. I mean, it's not always like that, with some musicians, but most of the musicians I've been able to play with, whether it was a Chris Squire or a Ray Gomez or Jeff Berlin or of course an Alphonse Mouzon and Newman, all these guys, I've always had this kind of extreme, what I would call an elevated empathy, and that is creating a special bond between us, between musicians, which defies all the laws of gravity, and it goes much further than that even, and that's what really makes a difference between certain musicians and others to put together.
Yeah, there's a bond. Steve Hackett, who we've actually interviewed 2 times for the site. He's a wonderful interview, but he also had a chance to work with Chris as well, and he said the same sorts of things, and he wrote a little tribute as well. And he just, sounds like he was a very special person to be involved with.
Yeah. I know Steve pretty well. Of course, I met him on the cruise to the edge last year. But it's funny you should mention him specifically today, because I just received that, an hour ago, from the authors of a great study book about human nature and social psychology, and Steve Hackett and I are actually on the first page of that book.
How interesting is that? Right?
Doing the plug. Maybe if I have your email address, I'll be able to send you that just the few first pages. That we are on the very first page, and I just received it now.
How's that for synchronicity?
But Chris, to come back to Chris Squire, he was a very special person. He was really living in his own kingdom. And he was really like a pioneer into his own style of playing the bass. And I remember that even though he was not, a classically trained musician, or even, those kind of guys, especially in England, they just, it's just an imperative, their career is what I call imperative, because it's like it comes as it goes and it develops as it goes, and they form their own style. And I remember that he was able to, in French we would say décortiquer. He was able to skin kind of a piece of music to the point of being able to completely rearrange it with us in terms of making it more a contrapuntic kind of piece, as opposed to just chords, and his bass was really part of that counterpoint and harmony and counterpoint, as opposed to just chordal kind of accompaniment that normally just bass players do generally,
Yeah.
And funny enough, in the piece, talking about Mark very quickly, in the piece which I wrote called Alien Intelligence, I think it's at 2 minutes 18, if my memory serves me right. But there's 1 minute of a bass solo I did on one of my keyboards, and when I was re-listening to it, at the time, of course, Chris was with the he was in great shape, no health problem or whatever. But I was always thinking about him when I composed that, when I played that piece, actually on my keyboard. And of course, the blend, the rest of the part with the basses with John Avila. But there's just that 1 minute which I did, and I always said I would love to be able to dedicate this minute of of my own bass playing, to his memory.
That's wonderful. And you know what? Knowing a little bit about your musical background and what interests you in music, mainly with in regards to percussion, I could see why his style of bass playing would be so attractive to you, because it's almost like a percussive attack of the instrument, the way he plays it. You could almost take the drums away. It's that rhythmic.
Absolutely. And also what I have noticed, of course, I don't know if, of course, that's a very, very specific thing that we musicians would be able to notice, immediately. But all his playing was always with a plectrum. And to be able to do this rhythmic accents and to play that rhythmically just only with the plectrum, he never played with his fingers, with his right hand.
Right.
He was always with the plectrum, and it's a very, very difficult. That's why he developed this incredible style, which is very, very personal to Chris Squire, because you know, there's a lot of bass players. I mean, the majority of bass players can, of course, use a plectrum, but they play with their fingers, you know. And
right.
when they play that, what we call the slap or whatever, you know, you cannot do it with the plectrum like he did. So he never did really what I would call a slap style, but he had this rhythmic impulses and dynamic, which was clearly defined by the fact that he was using a plectrum always.
Now, you've also done some work in the area of producing as well, correct, for your studios?
Yeah.
You know, some producers or musicians that cross over into producing, I always find very interesting, you know, because of what they generally bring to the table in a session. So some producers are very forceful with their vision, some are very non-intrusive. How would you describe your style as a producer? How would you describe it?
Well, it also has to do with probably the morality of politics and the upbringing of a musician. I'm very Swiss, really, and for me, neutrality has always been at the core of my beliefs, and peace as well. Mm-hmm. So I love an interaction between artists and musicians and so on. I'm not giving up easily on an idea or agreeing easily if there's some aspect of a disagreement. But generally speaking, it's always a very, very kind of gentle. There's never any forcefulness in what I'm doing with other people in a studio and other musicians and so on. And of course it has to do also with the fact that, you know, either it works or it doesn't. I mean, you know, first and foremost, of course nowadays we work a lot with machines in studios, and we can do that. There's always a possibility to adjust, you know, timings and dynamics and so on. But that is the prime concern, is that everything works perfectly, imbricated, rhythmically, first and foremost. And then after that, of course, the colors and the array of different sounds and the sonic aspect and of course the elements of constructivity in a piece of music are extremely important. Also the vocals, you know, very important, you know. But generally, no forcefulness at all in the studio. For example, I don't think I would have been able to work with, I don't know if I'm even dare mention his name, but, you know, a great producer who was extremely successful, but Phil Spector, for example. I don't think I would have been happy in the studio with him.
To control.
However, yeah. I mean, to a point that probably. I think producers we've worked with, whether it was, especially with Moody's, you know, the Dick Williams or Tony Visconti, excellent producers, excellent guys, and there was always a very, very good empathy with them. When I was with Yes, of course, the whole group, all the guys, you know, whether it was John Anderson, Alan and Steve and Chris together in the studio, that was already forming a very, very strong block of producers, you know, so to speak. And Eddie Offord was extremely skillful in what he was doing. So sometimes there were a few very agitated kind of discussions in the studio, and I remember even on the sessions of Relayer, I remember having been able to witness at some late nights mixing sessions about 8 hands on the 56 channel mixer that the opera used to use, instead of two hands, because everybody wanted to have the instrument louder and so on, and it was very, very funny in a way. Very strange.
Well, everybody has this idea, I guess, of where they want that gigantic wall of sound to go. What direction. But on a personal note with that, I just would like to just add that your work on that album is just sublime. It's just incredible, and I think Relayer would not be Relayer without you. I mean, that whole evolution of Yes would not be there, and just thank you. It's great. Thanks for the memories.
Well, I really appreciate that. I mean, it was a really, really big challenge, especially coming to the group in at the end of the first at the end of the first week of August. I remember it so well because Nixon was resigning. He was on TV. Although we were in the UK, we were in London. I was visiting, of course, John Anderson, who didn't live far away from where I was, and every day, the very few days of that end of the week and the week after, and then we started to record and be at Chris's studio in Buckinghamshire. And I remember that even the introduction to Sound Chaser was actually recorded in the very barn where I had been invited on that afternoon of the first week. I think it was a Wednesday afternoon of that first week of August. They played me the part of the song of Sound Chaser, which they had already, of course, composed and written and rehearsed. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was in the middle of the four of them, and they were playing at a speed and a wall of sound coming from all directions. I mean, you're talking about much more than 5.1 in there, And I was like, they played me that part of the song, and then they asked me what I would come up with as an introduction to that song. So that's exactly what I did. I played that on the road, which was in the studio. I think that road belongs actually to Vangelis. I think some of his keyboards have been there for like a couple of weeks, because they have tried to play with him for a few
I read that story, that you actually auditioned it on keyboards that were left, because whatever the political reasons. But I don't get that, because Relayer certainly would not have turned out the way it did if Vangelis had played, because in my mind he's much too sedate. I hear like something else would have come out of that. Maybe something more like Topographic Oceans, but not Relayer. Relayer is a real tour de force. It's very edgy, very, very edgy.
Right. I agree with you. However, it was probably very good for Vangelis.
True.
Because he was able to, he stayed of course in the UK without any problems, and he was able to actually interact with all these filmmakers, and and what he did. I mean, that was I knew Vangelis before that as a composer and as a musician from Paris. He was in Paris with Vangelis Papadanatou. He was playing. He had Aphrodite Child, the group Aphrodite Child, and they were already big stars in France. And I remember he had an array of keyboards which were completely different than anybody else's keyboard. He used echoes machines, echoplexes, extremely skillfully, but he had sometimes, I think some of his keyboards were linked to 3 or 4 different echoplex, and that's why the sounds were always kind of echoing, in space, and that was his style,
Yeah, they were extra spacey for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think Vangelis is a fantastic composer, and he has still now a recognition and a career that is absolutely fantastic, and I think that's because of what happened, and the fact that, you know, I'm sure they played with him for a good week, and you know, of course, John loved Vangelis and said maybe he couldn't really fit in, especially, as you said, you know, within the confines of Relaya, which was very, very complex and very very fast and very rhythmic and very contrapuntic and demanded an extreme a high level of discipline to play. You know, especially, I mean, talking about 40 years ago, you know. But, you know, when I came up with the introduction to Sound Chaser, I just did it there and then I explained, of course, the rhythm, the answers to Chris and Alan. They rehearsed it for a few minutes, and I think after 25 minutes, we had that whole introduction in the can. And Eddie often recorded it there and then, on the spot in that barn. Not that was not recorded at Chris's studio. That was recorded during that audition that day, that Wednesday. I remember that.
You know, as a keyboard player, your technical ability is legendary. I've read in your biography also that you had very early influences for classical styles, right? But it seems the styles that came to make you the most famous, like, you know, your experimentation with world musics, progressive rock, the jazz fusion, these were all learned later in your life. Can you point back to like some defining moments that made you want to move into popular music versus taking the route of, you know, the classical, more, you know, traditional musician?
Yeah, because for me, moving into direction I moved to allowed me to blend and to mix and to blend all these different styles, and to be able to breathe within each style without having a moral issue about the fact that, you know, I had to stay in one little confined space like modern jazz or beautiful, fantastic geniuses. I mean, I was able to even open to John Coltrane for several concerts in the 60s. When I came also to New York, actually, you know, you are from New York, so my very first arrival in New York was exactly 50 years ago, the 9th of November, and that this year will be, the 9th of November will be the 50th anniversary of my very first day in New York. That was the day of the blackout, you know.
Yeah, I remember.
That was an absolutely unbelievable experience. I'm going to have to put that in my book because, you know, one of these, or maybe organize some aspect of the celebration in New York. I'd love to do that. But what I'm saying is, when I arrived in New York, after that, I stayed a few weeks in New York, and would you believe that I was in the village all the time, in Village Vanguard, the Village Gate, and so on, and I met very, very early on, I was able to become very, very good friends with Roy Haynes, you know, the fantastic drummer, Roy Haynes, and he took me to all these clubs. And you know, he was very, very dapper. You know, I remember, he had one of those very fast cars, and he was the most elegant guy I could ever have met. You know, I mean, he even had a tie on with those. You know, the bar between, you know, up in the neck, and very, very extremely well dressed and so on. And he took me to all these clubs. He was friends with everybody, and I met so many jazz musicians during those few weeks I was in New York. It was absolutely unbelievable. And then I met them again and again and again and again during their visits to the Jazz Festival of Montreux, which had not started at the time. You know, it started in 1967, and the only great figure who never appeared at the Jazz Festival of Montreux, and I don't know why it didn't happen, is John Coltrane.
Right.
Coming back to what you were saying about the my career and the styles and so on, and being able to play with even with symphony orchestras. I mean, I've done a few movie scores. You know, I would have loved to do more, of course, but I've been acquainted with some orchestras and so on. In Switzerland, I don't know if it's the same in the States. I don't think it's the same in the States, but in England was very iffy at the time as well. The musicians of an orchestra couldn't stand being in the proximity of jazzers or rockers. Some of them, they were so rigid in there, and some conductors as well. In Switzerland, even more. You know, in the States, there has been this kind of very easygoing understanding between classical musicians and jazz musicians, and maybe even now, of course, rock and so on. But at the time, one had to really go further, and that's where the traveling to Africa, to the Middle East, to Japan, to India, and so on, to Brazil, of course, and South America came to play for me, because that's the way I was able to communicate. Since I at the time I didn't speak all these languages, the music was the common language, and I was very, very fortunate in that. In that experience, in that living experience.
We also had some questions posted by fans. Can we go over them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So Mike C, that's Mike C, would like to know, what's the most difficult keyboard solo you ever played?
When I arrived in Yes, with all the 7 symphonies I had to learn, although I had, of course, listened to the albums in the late 60s and the early 70s and so on, but to learn exactly all the moods of all these the tunes and so on, that was a really big challenge. And to come up also with what I came up with during the recording of the whole Relayer, that was a very, very, very big challenge. Where I really had to force myself to learn all material and to acquaint myself with this and that and that. And for example, I remember that I think in To Be Over, for example, I'm taking a little solo towards the end, a little synthesizer solo, and I remember that one I wrote down on paper during the session, and at one point I think they decided to change the key, so that night I wrote it in 2 different keys, exactly. It's a very, very contrapunting thing, and I realized that there was very, very few spaces of counterpoint where I could fit my notes, and that was a very challenging kind of solo, if you want,
Okay.
But I'm still very, very much in love with that one. I mean, To Be Over is such a special piece of music. It's beautiful.
It is.
Absolutely.
It's one of the prettiest songs, I think, from Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And it's kind of almost underrated. No, I know the fans have really appreciated the album, always through the decades. But To Be Over is not being reproduced or talked about that much, but it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of music, and I think it fits perfectly well at the end of the side tour of Relayer. Really.
I couldn't agree more. Now, George would like to know, who do you consider real innovators or game changers in the terms of sound design and electronic music composition. Who should people listen to more of? Besides Patrick.
Yeah, no. Keith, of course, Keith Emerson came up with some absolutely fantastic sounds with this big modular Moog. Early in the 70s, especially when he joined ELP, when they formed ELP, and I remember having listened to some of these albums over and over, and I was in absolute admiration to what he was doing. All these guys, Rick as well came up with some fantastic stuff. Whom I liked very much, and it was like, as an organist, was Brian Auger. I knew Jimmy Smith personally, and Brian Auger is a very, very good friend of mine, and every time I could go and see him or jam with him, the first see him, of course, in the late 60s and so on, in some clubs in Geneva or in Italy or something, I wouldn't miss a beat to be able to see him. He was such an influence. Of course, that was his playing. But Jan Hammer, as a synthesizer player, as a Moog soloist, the way he was bending the notes has been an unbelievable influence on me as well. And, of course, we were talking about Wendy Carlos and Tomita, who came up with some this incredible kind of arrangements of classical pieces and so on, and rearrangement and variations and so on. And I've got to say that not only keyboard, as pianists, my dad, well before, several decades before I was born, my dad was the Paderewski's production manager, and he always wanted me to be a concert pianist and so on. So he took me, I remember when I was 5, he took me on his shoulders in Switzerland during a very snowy night, and the first big piece of music I heard was Beethoven's Fifth. He opened. It was in a hall very far. We had to take the train and so on. And I was not even 5. I think I was like 4.5, 4. I must have been 4 because at 5 I was in another town. Yeah, and we were late because it was snowing and so on. And I heard the da 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 da. And the doors opened of that. It was like a church, but it was not a church. It was a hall. A big 90-piece orchestra playing that. That was the most unbelievable kind of sonic experience and musical experience I've ever. That was my very first sonic and musical experience I had in a big way. Now to come back to the keyboard players and so on. A lot of those modern composers and players, like Joe Zawinul, absolutely genius, Joe Zawinul, the Paul Carrolls, from Toto and so on. And to hear, I'm sure that there are some players from other countries than just in the United States. I'm naming just a few here, but I've heard some unbelievable musicians and like Stockhausen and Xenakis and all these guys those composers were so advanced in their research of music and the perfection of sound and Boulez and so on. Of course, I'm naming some people who are not really known to the American audiences and so on that much, but to listen not only to the players but to the compositions, but for somebody who wants to listen to something very important is to John Lewis told me from the Modern Jazz Quartet when I was a kid. He told me, because I had a chance to meet him when I was like 13 or 14. He told me, listen to all the music of the world, all the ethnic ethnologic music of the world, the transcultural aspect of the music. I mean, the Armenian music with the time signatures and so on. I mean, it's like unbelievable. Indian music, Indonesian music. It's fantastic.
Well said.
It's very, very deep and interesting question, and even philosophical question, and I love that. I mean, I absolutely love that. I'd love to. I'm really looking forward to listen to your music as well, because I realize that you've done some film music and more, and so on.
It's still very humbling, to speak to someone like yourself who has just such a body of work, and it's just been wonderful to speak with you, and I've truly enjoyed this. And I would like to ask you something now. In closing, our magazine features artists who've made what we consider extraordinary careers, people who've inspired us to create and explore music. So, my parting question to you, what words of wisdom would you leave for aspiring career musicians?
Practice, play, express yourself, always be yourself, remain yourself, but develop your musical conscience and open your eyes and your ears and your mind to all the musics of the world, and please make sure that your rhythm is absolutely impeccable.
I knew something like that was going to come out.
To also add quickly, because we of course we didn't have the time to talk about so many things, but I wanted to also say that great influences of mine were, of course, not necessarily in that order, but maybe more chronological order or something. But it's also, of course, the Art Tatum, James P. Johnson, Oscar Peterson, of course, and of course Keith Jarrett, Miles Davis, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, who are very good friends, at least Herbie and Chick, and very, very good, very big influences for me. All these pianists and more, of course. But I'm naming just a few. And Errol Garner, man. I mean, absolutely phenomenal. I remember having one. When I was 16 to age 21, I won the Jazz Festival of Zurich in my category, either piano solo or with my trio or with my quartet, 5 years in a row. But the first time I won, when I was 16, I was given a record of Errol Garner and a couple of lessons with Stefan Grappelli, who actually was not only the brilliant musician we know, but he was a fantastic pianist as well.
Really?
He showed me in two lessons. He was in Geneva, he was doing concerts, but he happened to be there, and it was arranged by the radio there. That was actually before going to the Zurich Festival, the Jazz Festival, but that was the semi-finals in Geneva in the radio, and he was there, and he gave me 2 lessons, and he taught me so much in 2 lessons. Man, I mean, as a pianist, he was as good as a violinist.
That is amazing, and he's quite a violinist, right? I mean.
Oh man, absolutely, yeah.
Talk about having the devil in the stick. I mean.
He was a very gentle person, very, very elegant, very nice person, very nice.
It's quite a career, Patrick, I have to say.
Thank you so much for your interview, and thank you for your really, really great question. I'm really looking forward. Thank you so much.
Yes, you have a wonderful day, Patrick, and again, just thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much. All the best.